let me get into this, and what I am going to talk about, I'm going to give you an overview of the EMP threat. We'll talk about the electrical grid system and how that's affected the relationship. The phenomenon itself is something that I'll try to explain in terms that you can understand why this is so serious now. I will talk about a little bit more in detail of my personal experience that laid the foundation for what I'm doing now. The various threats that we're faced with today, man-made and natural. This is something that's not just worrying about North Korea, the Chinese, the Iranians, or the Russians. God has a threat out there that could be every bit as devastating. We'll talk about that. And I'll talk a little bit about the status of where we are in Texas and where we aren't. And then there's one issue, a piece of this is tied to the economic outlook for Texas if we were to step up and start hardening our grid that most people have overlooked in the past.
A city in chaos. Rioting and looting have been reported as widespread power outages continue across the area and throughout the nation tonight.
Are you okay?
I'm so scared. What if they try to kill him?
Honey, where are you? Are you there?
Mom! Mom!
Okay. When we first started putting this presentation together, we had some folks that wanted to help us out. And so they put that video together for us. And there's some serious technical inaccuracies in that, but I wanted to play it anyhow. One is you wouldn't hear any sirens in the background and nobody be using a telephone. The candles would work.
Right.
They'd be okay, the candles, but that's all there would be to it. Electromagnetic pulse is the only thing that contained within one weapon could absolutely, totally debilitate the entire United States. It takes one detonated about 250 nautical miles above the central part of the United States, and everything that's electronic or electrical would cease to operate. And I'll talk about it in a little more detail later. And what makes this so difficult or so serious today as compared to like when I was growing up back in the 50s and 60s, electricity was a luxury. It really was not a mainstay or in line with life itself. And a lot of people knew how to grow vegetables. There was still had a little bit of agrarian in places, in a lot of places. But today, in today's environment, the third most important thing to sustaining life is our electricity. The only two things more important are air and water. Because without electricity, there are a lot of people who would live longer without food than they will without electricity. And so it is absolute necessary for our way of life. And our geopolitical environment has changed. I mean, I grew up in a leave it to beaver world compared to what we have today. And we've had for years and for almost forever thought about a threat to the United States is really only from Russia or China. They're the only two that would have enough manpower and the weapons to take on the mighty United States. I mean, we have aircraft carriers, we've got bombers, we've got everything. There's no other nation that could bring America to its knees but those two. And thank goodness, during the time when the weapons built up, we did adopt the policy of assured destruction. And I'll tell you, that is what kept us from ever going to war during that time period, was the knowledge that no matter who fired first, both sides would lose. So we went through, because we were faced with enemies that they wanted to live, we wanted to live. So if we were going to get into a fight where we both died, it didn't make much sense to get into that fight. We no longer have an enemy like that. Our enemies today that are a formidable threat to us, not only do they not care that they would die, they are eager to die in the process of trying to kill the great Satan. So that is, any of those who've been in the military in here, you know that when you're fighting an enemy, that is not worried about their life, you have a formidable enemy to fight. It's different. And so we have a totally different environment today, that our threats come from not just major nations, but from rogue nations like Iran, Iraq, and even small groups that are self-identified. Now, let's talk about the electrical grid system. If you look up there, you'll see that the electrical power grid in the United States is divided into three major groups. There's the eastern, the western, and then there's Texas. Now, I'll explain to you the one at the bottom that says that doesn't look like the Texas I normally see on the map. Well, it's because there are some parts of Texas that are outside the Texas grid of ERCOT. That is the organization of the basic grid in Texas is connected to others, but there's not the core function of it. We have about 85% of Texas is self-contained, which means that we have complete control over our grid system, and we could harden it and protect it without permission. I finally interviewed with a major that he and I hit it off real well. He was from Alabama and had gone to the Naval Academy. We worked out. He showed up one day, came back. He'd been gone the whole time that I was interviewing, and talked to him about what he was doing, and he looked really tired. And he said, you know, I got such a workload. He said, I'd hire anybody. Take that desk over there. So that's how I got my job, was that he was just overworked and he'd take anybody. So he did. And within about 3 years, I went from that to kind of being the go-to person for solving problems, because that kind of came out of my training at the Citadel, that you just go after something until you fix it, get it done, and some really good management, leadership training that we had. I was able to organize people. Anyway, I would get problems done. But I was in the ground side. I was over there in the launch control facilities. The missile itself was in a completely different office than what I was in. So all of our work had to do with the ground system. But then in sometime in early 1967, a group from DARPA, the Defense Research folks, came out to the program office, and in a very highly classified meeting, they told us that we had a very serious problem with the Minuteman missile because it was vulnerable to an EMP. And everybody said, what's an EMP? And so they explained what it was, and that the Russians, instead of having to target each of our silos or our launch control facilities, could destroy our missiles in flight. Now, I'll point that out because we had about a 6-minute powered flight, that if they were just to lob one over every few minutes, high altitude, they could destroy all our missiles, and the balance of assured destruction that I talked about earlier was totally wiped out. And so from an operational standpoint, I can tell you that the 4-star generals were sweating a lot at that time and saying, we got to fix this. And so they started a program to harden the missile. That's a term that's used to protect it against the nuclear effect, is to harden the missile. After several months of working on it, the missile, they were not getting anywhere with getting a solution to it. And the general was upset, and he decided to reorganize. He did reorganize, and in the process, he reached over into the ground system and picked this junior guy, just made captain, this junior captain, and said, you're in charge of this project, fix it. And I said, okay, yes sir. And I looked at the project, and the real challenge I had was that the 9 program managers that I had to pull together and make this happen, the lowest rank was a lieutenant colonel. I was a junior captain, had colonels and lieutenant colonels. They weren't happy about it either. But I'll skip some of the things that we went through, but we got the job done. We got it back on schedule, got it working, got the missiles deployed. I left the Air Force. I never told anybody what I had done because it was so highly classified. It was one of those things that was way above top secret, that what we were doing. So my family never knew about it. None of my friends, I just never said anything about it. And then about 9 years ago, I saw a magazine laying on a table in, I think it was a doctor's office. I think it was something like Popular Science magazine, and it said something about EMP threatens U.S. grid. And I looked at that and I said, what in the world are they talking about? Because we didn't think anything about the power grid in those days. Back in those days, that was not the big issue. You were going to have nuclear weapons going off. Weren't really worried about the grid. So I picked it up and read it. And I said, boy, I thought this was all classified. They were talking about stuff that I thought was classified. But they referenced a report from the Congressional White House EMP Commission that they had written. And so I thought, that sounds interesting. So I got a copy. It arrived on a Friday, and I started reading it, and I was absolutely mesmerized by what I read. It was about that thick, and I just spent the whole weekend reading that thing. I thought, wow, I had not thought about a lot of this. This is really neat stuff. So I read it. I was really impressed with what they had, and I said, I wonder who wrote this thing. And I went back and looked at the authors, and there were some of the same people that I'd worked with in the Air Force that were now concerned about this, working out through the White House on the EMP Commission. Well, that was nice. I mean, I thought that was impressed with that. But then about a few weeks later, I was at a Tea Party meeting giving a presentation on C-scope. Anybody remember the problem we had with C-scope? I mean, that's how far off the subject. Talking about C-scope, and there was a gentleman there from Washington, D.C. that I'd never met before by the name of Frank Gaffney. Anybody know Frank Gaffney? Okay. We just happened to be there. We were talking on C-scope, and we got into a side conversation about problems he was having in other areas. He started talking about the EMP Commission and trying to get things done in Washington. And I thought that was interesting, and we had a little conversation, and we separated, went our different ways. But that piqued my interest even more. And then a few weeks later, I ran into someone that was a colleague of his at another totally unrelated event. And we got back to the same subject, and then Frank got back into the conversation. And about that time, it turned out that I had about decided to run for office. And Frank said, if you get elected to office, you need to fix Texas. And so that's how we got there. And if you don't think God's hand was in all that machinations that was going on, it was. But let me get back to the natural EMP threat, the solar threat, coronal mass ejection. They come off of the sun all the time, going in all directions. And they really don't affect us here on Earth, except when they come off of the sun in a direction that's going to that the Earth would intercept. And they come off in various degrees, various sizes. Mostly have, they're not identical to an EMP, but they're very similar, particularly with the power grid. Is more what they affect, not so much the electronics.
They've also affected large computers for years.
Yes, they were anything that's power consumption like that. They have. But it is well documented that they take place. The first one that we know of that had a major impact was in 1859. And for those of you who think, well, we didn't have any electricity then. Yeah, we did. We had a telegraph system. It fried the telegraph system in the United States from coast to coast. It sent operators to the hospital with some very bad burns. It set railroad ties on fire. It warped tracks, railroad tracks, so they looked like pretzels. And he did it here in the United States and in Europe. And then in 1989, there was a solar storm that hit Quebec in the northeast part of the United States, knocked out the power to several million people up there that has occurred. So these are real. And they're say if one the size of the 1859 were to occur, it would be as devastating as a nuclear weapon. Now, I've got, we were first putting this together, we got some help from the Blades. And they had a program, Lori Dew, that she's done a couple of programs, and so they gave us a short video. Let's see if I can get this to play.
An EMP is a massive electromagnetic pulse. It can be released from a nuclear device detonated at a high altitude, destroying electrical grids for hundreds of miles. The aftermath of such an attack could be devastating. Distribution of food and medicine would be nearly impossible. There would be a shortage of clean water, and first responders would be left with no means of communication. Now, this may sound like something out of an apocalyptic thriller, but this is not fiction. This is a critical national security issue that leaders from both parties take seriously because they know that rogue nations and terrorist groups dream of a world without the United States.
After 9/11, Congress ordered a series of studies on weapons of mass destruction. In 2004, the EMP Commission delivered a report on the threat of an electromagnetic pulse attack on the United States.
The EMP Commission published 5 reports, 3 were classified and 2 were unclassified. The 2 unclassified were in 2004 and 2008. They laid out a scenario where a very entry-level weapon in the 20 kiloton range was lobbed at not a very high altitude over Cincinnati, Ohio.
Michael Del Rosso is an engineer and Pentagon consultant. He has worked with the EMP Commission, and he has participated in confidential congressional briefings on nuclear threats to America.
And the reason they chose that target is because that weapon with the radius of line of sight at the altitude, which was a nominal altitude, would have covered 74.5% of all the electric generating capacity in the United States and 83% of the substations in the United States, the majority of the population.
Bill Graham, who was the chair, the one statement he made that I think needs to be remembered is EMP is one of a small number of effects that has existential consequences that could threaten the existence of the United States.
George Baker is Professor Emeritus of Applied Science at James Madison University. He sits on the Board of Advisors for the Congressional Task Force on National and Homeland Security.
The effects could be so widespread that, in fact, you'd have breakdown of governance. In Bill Graham's testimony, he thought that upwards of 50% of the population would die within the first year.
For the Record has learned that in 1995, a Russian think tank presented a report to the Russian army recommending the military align with rogue nations, sharing both weapons of mass destruction and missile technology.
There was testimony in 2004 by Soviet flag officers that they rather sheepishly said that technology for super EMP weapons had actually leaked out to North Korea and other rogue nations.
We think enough word of it is leaked out, and it's not a very technically complex idea, that it could well be the case that the North Koreans could pull off something like that.
There's no one that will deny with any credibility that the reason why North Korea and Iran are self-professed emerging nuclear threats to the United States of America is because Russia and China want them to be and have enabled them to be. This is not idle thought. This is what nation states like Iran and North Korea have spent billions of dollars developing this capability, and they're doing it for a reason, and they say the reason is the fact that they see the United States as their primary adversary.
On July 9, 1962, the United States conducted a high-altitude nuclear test over the Pacific Ocean. It was called the Starfish Prime Test, and the electrical pulse from the blast was felt 900 miles away in the Hawaiian Islands. The data collected from that event showed the U.S. military the potential damage an EMP can cause, information they have had for more than 50 years.
After the Starfish Prime test, the U.S. government immediately took steps to protect military assets.
The Department of Defense, as they built out the Minuteman system, the ground system, and the missiles, included EMP protection in the Minuteman system. It's been 50 years ago.
So we've hardened that capability tremendously, again, at the cost of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. But our civilian grid, upon which 99% of the military's electricity in CONUS is dependent upon, is essentially unprotected.
I think that's largely right. I think the only civilian systems that were hardened were the President's airplane and maybe some of his command and control, assuming you want to consider that civilian. But no one was thinking of protecting the civilian infrastructure.
And that is the great conundrum here for me, is that one of two things is true. Either the military has this wrong, and this is no problem, and therefore we should stop spending all the money to harden against it. Or if it is a problem, then we should harden the grid upon which the military depends for 99% of its electricity needs in this continent.
Nobody's in charge of the electric grid. You think Department of Energy? No. Department of Energy basically works on nuclear waste and funds nuclear laboratories. There's a small office that deals with electric grids, but nobody that has any real power. This is something that is not being dealt with. It is improvements in it are fought by industry, and it's extremely frustrating because it's very dangerous to let this grid sit there the way it is while the Russians and Chinese have fully and completely protected theirs. Yes.
They're ready.
Yes.
What does that matter?
Well, it tells you that on this issue, the Russians and Chinese are more responsible than we are.
In 2004, the Congressional EMP Commission estimated that it would take a one-time investment of $2 billion to harden the entire U.S. electrical grid against an EMP.
Anyway.
That's all?
Huh?
That's all?
Well, that's a partial right answer. No, it's going to take more than that. That's to make it recoverable. We need to go much further than that. The bottom line is that this would be widespread catastrophe for the United States. Absolute power we would lose 9 out of 10 Americans in 18 months. The federal government study they did estimated we'd lose 90% in 11 months in there. So, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's not real bright. I thought we were going to get farther this past session, but the federal government did make some progress. Trent Franks, who you saw in there, and incidentally, most of the people that you saw in that video, we have been working with here in Texas to help get this thing advanced here. They did get a bill, a SIPA bill called the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act that will begin taking a look at it. But with Texas, with our self-contained grid, there is no reason for us not to step up and go out and actually protect our grid ourselves.
Could you back up, please?
We know what it takes. There are nations that have done this. Israel is protected their grid. Our lieutenant governor was over there last summer, and they gave him a briefing on what they were doing. We know the Arab Emirates are, the Chinese, the Russians, South Korea have all taken the steps to some degree to harden their electrical grid. And we did get this in our Republican platform. It's one of the first times that something for the first time around got actually put in the Republican platform as an item for us to protect our electrical grid. And but there's one aspect of this that everybody overlooks that I think is probably one of the most important ones, and that is that if we were to harden our grid, it would be the single biggest economic boom that Texas could possibly ever do. We couldn't even come close to this with our enterprise fund and our other ways that we bribe companies to move to Texas with tax abatements and things like that. As the world or the business community begins to understand how devastating this would be, and Texas were to run the flag up that says, hey, when the lights go out, they will be back on in Texas first. They would move here. We'd probably have to put border guards in Oklahoma. Because the military is the same way. The military, if we were to be hardening our grid, because they use the same power you do, hardening our grid that would provide the military bases protection, I don't think they would ever close another base in Texas. They'd probably move a lot of assets here. So it has a huge benefit. So to answer the question, why can't we get this done? Well, there is what I put together, a self-serving triad in Texas that we have to overcome. We have ERCOT, which is the overall controlling body, the PUC, Public Utilities Commission, And we have the power companies. And I didn't put the power companies at the top of that triangle by accident. They're actually the ones that are in control, in charge of everything that happens. ERCOT and PUC really don't make a move that power companies don't agree to. But they are the ones that lobbied against it. They're the ones that fought against doing this. And I don't have an answer, because you answer, why in the world would they do that? It escapes me. The only thing I can come up with is we have most of these power companies are run by executives that are more concerned about their personal paychecks and bonuses than they are about doing the right thing. And we don't have any real leadership in our government agencies overseeing it that has the backbone to stand up to them and say, we need to go do this. Now, having said that, I will also say that there are some power companies in Texas on their own that have actually started doing things to provide grid protection. But it is not nearly enough of what it needs to be done out there. So how do we do this? Well, we're going to come back again. I have got assurance from Lieutenant Governor that he will authorize an interim study that will be equivalent of the bill that I tried to get passed during this past session. Just for your information, we came very, very close. I worked with Representative Tan Parker. He carried a bill in the House. I carried a bill in the Senate. They were not identical, they were similar. His bill left out the power generating stations because he couldn't get the votes in the House if the power generating stations were in there. If you're not getting the message, power companies are a tremendously powerful lobby here in Texas. I got my bill out of the Senate with only 3 Democrats voting against it. Tan got his bill out of the House unanimous. My bill went over the Committee on State Affairs, Byron Cook, and he killed it. Would not allow it to have a hearing. Tan Parker's came over to Business and Commerce, headed up by Kelly Hancock. Kelly Hancock would not let that bill have a vote.
Give us the reason why.
I never could get a reason from him.
Why did Cook kill it?
Because he's Byron Cook. I mean, that's his nature. His excuse to me was, I passed one bill out of this committee, and that was Tan Parker. He said, I'm not going to waste people's time passing another. So that was the answer he gave me. I never could get one from Hancock. So that's where it died. I passed 2 resolutions to try to set up interim study commissions on it. Both of those got out of the Senate, never got a hearing in the House. Keep the pressure on.
They're both Republicans.
Huh?
And they're both.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. No. Don't let that fool you about what beats in their heart down there. So, hopefully we'll get enough new representatives elected. I think we can get it out of the Senate again. I've gotten it out twice now, 2 sessions in a row. We got a bill out to this. I think we can do it again. The Congress in Washington, they've been trying since 2000. And so for us to just have 2 sessions here that unsuccessful is we're not quite as bad off as they are. But we'll continue to work on it. I will be turning in tomorrow our request for an interim study, and I do expect to get that in detail. I had one last time, but we had some changes in committee chairman, and the chairman of the committee that was overseeing the power companies wouldn't let us have the study. So.
What about the Texas congressmen at the U.S. level?
Oh, they are all for this. Last session, they wrote a letter to Governor. 23 of our Republican congressmen signed a letter to Governor Abbott telling him that the Congress was bogged down, they were not going to get the job done, and he needed to step up and lead the nation by having Texas harden its grid.
What about the Democrats up there? From Texas?
I have not had any communication with them on it. You say, wait.
Is there some way to get, or maybe the names of some of the people, CEOs and board of directors of the power companies? The reason I'm asking this is most people don't know, for example, that George Soros is a major stockholder in Texas Instruments. And you start getting names of who these people are. Are they from other countries?
Well, No, I don't. What I've suggested to people is that whoever your power supplier is, you start contacting them about wanting to have your grid protected. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a master list
Wait.
of all of the power companies?
They're all public
That
utilities.
we
They're
can
just
contact?
public utilities. You could get that from the public utility company.
Go on the
PUC.
internet, go on the
Yes,
internet. look
yes,
them up.
ma'am.
You haven't said anything about how it affects solar panels and that sort of thing. So, with more people getting solar on their own homes that feeds back into the grid, what are the
Well,
complications there?
There are solar, I am told, I've had people that are in the solar business. I don't know the absolute answer. I don't know what tests have been run. You see, to get the answer to that, you really have to run some very expensive tests on items. There are people that say their solar panels will survive, but there are electronics associated with those solar panels that probably won't survive. So the panel itself might, but being able to use it will be questionable.
And the transmission.
And yeah, getting it out of there. The thing that you can do that I'm not sure how, unless it's widespread in there, is to put electronics, radios, two-way radios into what's called a Faraday cage, metal container. A garbage can will do the job, just so you have a good seal on the top of it. And you don't have the item, you put cardboard, so you get something in there so they're not touching the side, so the items are isolated away from the metal on the inside, and they're contained, that will protect it in there. Yes, sir.
So, could you explain, because my impression is that EMP like fries everything. So what good does the grid working if you have nothing that'll plug into it?
Okay.
So does hardening the grid protect your computer plugged into your house?
No, there will have to be individual.
Bob, could you repeat the question? We can't hear it back.
Okay, he was asking, when this happened, everything's going to get fried. So if we have electricity, nobody's going to be able to use it. Well, the answer, that is true. That is part of the problem. The hardening of the grid is a starting point. We have to have that hardened. That's the thing that falls under the government's purview of requiring the power companies to do this. Businesses, it'll be up to them to protect their equipment so they can operate and use the electricity when it's available, and as will the residents. The folks I've talked to that produce the items say they can provide the protection scaled down for residents and for equipment so that there will be, they can be more survival. And so it's a matter of all of it has to come together. But our role in government, our responsibility is to protect the people. And therefore we start with the power companies having the electricity. It wouldn't make any sense for the homeowners to be able to come up with a way to protect everything in their home, but they have no electricity to run it. And the business is the same way. Let me go back here for a second.
Have you been able to give the House leadership an overview of this problem? I mean, it sounds like a silly question, but I mean, it might go a long ways toward.
I do not know to what extent the representatives in the House have tried to work this through the House. It's not something that, that's kind of accepted procedure for me to do that in the Senate.
Yeah.
They like for us to keep our hands out of their business and vice versa. So, yes, sir. Let me check.
What's your estimate of the cost just to protect the Texas grid then, approximately?
And the time
Ballpark?
Yeah.
I mean, 5 billion, 10 billion?
It's not going to be anything like that. I think from the discussions I've had with people, to the extent we started a cost estimate last year, and we got almost through it enough that I would say that it would be in the $2 billion range to do Texas. That's a rough
So
estimate.
the power companies mainly opposed to it because the bill is requiring them to pay maybe too much?
It makes no sense because
They'll be out of business without it, right?
the amount of money we're talking about, but who pays for it? I'm going to tell you exactly who's paid for it. It's the people sitting in this room.
Right.
There is no such thing as federal money. There's no such thing as state money. And the electricity, you pay for everything they do. It comes out of our pocket. So it's citizens pay. And we were working it so it would be a rate, qualified in a rate. Hey, We spent $7 billion on the schemes to put windmills out in West Texas and bring the power back so they can charge you more money for that electricity coming from the windmills. And so it's well within the range of what's reasonable for what's really. Let me do one more, and I think I'll probably run over time here.
Well, Governor Abbott says it's a special item. Potentially, I assume he'll get reelected, and would it be a special item for him, do you think?
That's a special item. Governor Abbott has told me on 2 different occasions that this issue was a priority for his office.
But it didn't end up a priority this last time.
No. So, there's a gap between that. I tried very hard to get it on as an item in the special session, but that die was cast before we even went back down there. So, all right, one more. Now,
If this does happen to Texas, is there a recovery period? I mean, is it like after 2 years, or is it?
Ma'am, this is beyond what we would survive. I mean, you take a look at what happened down there in Houston. They survived because of all the people that came in from the outside. There's no outside to come from. There is no. This is complete. Watch it. There are no spare parts. And if there were spare parts, there are no vehicles that would be moved to carry it. There will be no people out there. I mean, you talk about an environment when after a few days, our first responders are going to be faced with the challenge. Do I stay home and protect my wife and children? Or do I go do what I'm supposed to be doing because riots are breaking out over here and you're in a full survival mode?
Can't move food.
There is no recovery.
Have you read this Lights Out by Ted Koppel, and do you?
I have read that. He addresses it from a cyber standpoint primarily. If you want to get an idea of what it would be like, read the book 1 Second After. Right. Mm-hmm. 1 Second After, and then there's a sequel 1 year after. If you can bring yourself to read that after finishing 1 Second After. All right. Well, thank you guys very much. I appreciate it. If you have no